Good afternoon, and thanks for signing up for this session on flipping your classroom in your classroom. My name's Scott McLeod, and I want to welcome you to what some would consider the new world of learning and a teaching technique that could really change what you do in your classroom, and most importantly, how you do it. As we all know by now, our students are so much different than they were even 10 years ago, and way different than we were when we were in high school. We've all seen the technology door broken down in our classrooms, and for most of us, we've stopped fighting the good fight against technology. Remember when we were trying to ban cell phones from our school? For most of our students, technology is really just a way of life and not anything really that special. Our students are highly devised, highly networked, highly interactive, and boy do we know they are highly social. Come on now. I know that a lot of you carry your cell phones everywhere you go now and freak out when you don't have them, right? I now wonder what I did before I got my own cell phone. Okay, now let's take just a brief tour of the current stats on our students. Take a look. These numbers no longer shock us, right? Even though they're from 2005, they're probably even larger than they are now, or they're larger now than they were then. We may disagree with why our students spend so much of their time this way, but the fact is they do. The stat that sticks out for me is that 26% of our students 8 to 18 years old use more than 2 media at the same time. And maybe you do too. Just like we can no longer fight the tide of Huskies, Glicks, and NGSS standards, technology is simply not going to go away. In fact, it's just the opposite. To our students, computers aren't technology, and multitasking is simply a skill they begin to learn at an increasingly younger age. My 2.5-year-old granddaughter gets on my iPad and swipes her way to YouTube to find Frozen or SpongeBob in seconds flat. Seriously, it's no big deal to her. As we move forward, reality is more and more a meaningless term. Students are way ahead of the technology curve, much farther than we give them credit for. Whether we want to accept it or not, the way students learn is changing faster and faster each year, each day maybe. Our students today want to be active contextual learners who are engaged. This engagement needs to be both interactive and social at the same time. Today's students demand it, and more we are being required to integrate technology into our classrooms using this model. We need to figure out how to teach in the way our students learn the best. I know we've all seen this learning pyramid before. Today's session introduces a tool that addresses the bottom third of this pyramid using podcasts like the one you are listening to right now to engage your students bell to bell and beyond. So to address these needs, we try to open up class time for active learning strategies. Undoubtedly, you'll be asking the following question. I know I did for a long time. But how do I do that and still provide the same coverage of the content? Alright, so what the heck is a flipped classroom anyway? More and more teachers are encouraged to stop being the sage, the traditional sole disseminator of information in the classroom. And they're encouraged to become a sort of guide for the students in their learning process. In this slide, you see an example of the classic pure flipped classroom. Remember, I'm not talking about the pure flipped classroom in here today. I'm talking about flipping your classroom in the classroom. So let's make a distinction between the two. In the true flipped classroom environment, You would send your kids home and have them access a podcast like this one on your website, much like the one you're listening to right now. Students would then listen to it at their own pace while communicating with peers and teachers via online discussions. The idea being that the actual learning would happen in the classroom using hands-on activities that would enhance what they watched the previous night. But the pure flipped classroom makes a ton of assumptions. First of all, that all your students have internet access at home and a computer to access it with. Wrong. For me, this was always the sticking point in trying to flip my classrooms. More and more universities are using flipped classrooms because they can make sure each of their students are provided with a laptop. As a public school educator, that's most definitely not always the case. I just had a former student of mine from Michigan Tech come back and visit me over the holidays, and her chemistry class is completely flipped at Michigan Tech. So it is happening right now, whether we want to believe it or not. Okay, so why try it now? Well, last year I attended a session at McCall Conference in Grand Rapids titled Flipping Your Classroom in Your Classroom. I liked the methods they introduced so much I decided to try it the last 9 weeks of the year on my Earth and Space Science classes. The response I got still amazes me today. Not only did my students really enjoy the podcasts, but their scores went up immediately, and their understanding of the material in class was deeper and more practical than I'd ever anticipated, and certainly more than I'd ever experienced before. Now, the difference in a pure flip and what I do is that my students watch podcasts on specific topics the first half of the hour of class using the classroom set of laptops our school provides. The second half of the hour is spent doing practical hands-on activities that enhance what they've just learned about. Now, in today's jargon, this would be a blended learning classroom environment. What that means is that you would mix in traditional methods like lecture, worksheets, homeworks, labs, questions, etc., with podcasting in order to get the students to learn. Now, what's happened in my own classroom is that not only do students have more control over their own learning, but they also have control over the pace at which they learn this material. What totally surprised me was how many students comment positively about this learning style because they can pause the podcast or even go back to pick up material they've missed across all the learning levels. In fact, I got most of the positive feedback from what I would consider my most challenged students. The work they submitted was much higher quality and much more usable and in-depth as well. Now, what I mean by usable is that they now have a high-quality resource to study with that they created themselves. These students become much more confident, and I found myself complimenting them on their work. What a great deal. Lots of times the challenged students get the encouragement from us and, hey, Johnny, you need to keep up, or you need to hand in missing assignments, or what I mean to say is it's not always positive. But when you can see these kids work and it's high quality, it's a great opportunity for you to compliment them, and that then boosts their own self-respect. And I think you get better quality work and better learning in that environment. Okay, now let me show you what works for me in my own classroom. We all have pacing guides in our subject areas, so knowing what to teach is now predetermined, right? Gone are the days of teaching what we like and are interested in. Sad but true. Because all our concepts are pre-chosen, it's now up to us to develop some kind of a strategy to get these concepts understood and learned. My goal in using a podcast is to introduce a main concept to my students using a free tool called Screencast-O-Matic. Now take a second and download it onto your computer because you're going to need it later. You see the link down here at number 5. Now how and why you use the podcast varies from instructor to instructor and maybe even from topic to topic depending on what you teach. Remember, I can only show you how I use this technology in my own classroom. How you use it depends on what you want to accomplish. Okay, so this is the screen you should get when you download Screencast-O-Matic. Once you are there, sign up for an account by clicking the Login button. Login button's over here on the right-hand side. So click that Login button, and then you'll put your information in to establish your own Screencast-O-Matic account. So then once you hit the login, unless you have a Screencast-O-Matic account, if you do, then you'd log in. If not, then you're going to register with your email and a password. It doesn't cost anything, and we're going to be talking about it today a little bit. Now, I use Moodle to do most of my assessments and to assign work in my class. And I've been using Moodle for about 5 years now because our ISD no longer supported Microsoft Class Server, which I used for several years before we started Moodle. Moodle is an amazing time saver and very easy to use once you get the hang of it. The problem is most people don't want to spend the time getting the hang of it. So here's a screenshot of a typical week in my Earth Science class in Moodle. So let's go through a week. Let's talk about this week right here. So in this week we started the rock cycle. So here's the link now for the rock cycle. Now this is part 2. Above you would have seen the link for rock cycle part 1. But let's go through the part 2 part. So the students would click on the rock cycle part 2, and that would access the podcast. Now for each podcast, students produce 2 important pieces of work. So again, you see the link for the actual podcast for our beginning lesson on the rock cycle right here. And all you're doing is pasting the URL, and I'll talk about where you get the URLs for this podcast here in a second. Students click on the link, and then they take notes while they're listening to this podcast. Once they're done with the notes, they take a picture of them using their laptop or cell phone, whichever is easiest. Now, I have my own YouTube channel that stores these podcasts and allows students to access them, but you can also just store them on Screencast-O-Matic, which you just registered for. So here's a sample screenshot of what the students would see when they clicked on a podcast link. Now this one's on YouTube, but like I said, Screencast-O-Matic also stores any of these podcasts you make. So this particular podcast was part of a summer assignment my AP Biology students do before they get back to school next fall. The next fall. Right now, you're viewing a podcast that I made using a PowerPoint and Screencast-O-Matic. I think PowerPoint is the most flexible way because you can pick backgrounds and it's easy to paste pictures and cut and paste pictures, etc. in there. Students would then do that same thing. On any given day in my classroom, you would see all my students with headphones on and their notebooks out taking notes. But the room would be nearly silent. Now in my classroom podcasts, I'm telling them exactly what needs to be written in their notes. So I'm dictating to them in the podcast what to write down. I'm not lecturing them and have them wonder what to write. I'm telling them what to write down. So on the right-hand side of the slide, you see an example of a student's notes written while they were viewing a podcast, including a very well done rock cycle diagram that you see right here. So they got these notes because I told them what to write in the actual podcast. And again, once they've written their notes, They take a picture of them using either their classroom laptop or their cell phones, whichever is easiest for them. Then they submit that picture to Moodle. And you've got to be asking yourself, wow, that sounds like a lot. Well, it is right up front. So the first week of class, you're doing some teaching and you're doing some technology teaching as well. But I'm telling you, once students understand what you want them to do in terms of technology, it's just simply not a problem. Once the students are finished submitting their notes, they produce second piece of work from the podcast. Students go to Moodle and open up the study guides I make for each of the podcasts I do. They use their own notes and the podcasts if necessary to answer these questions right there on the study guide. Now I have them use bold print or a different color or font, so when I open up the study guide to grade them, I can tell the questions from the answers. Now, not only do the students have high quality notes to study with, they have a completely filled out study guide to use for our weekly quizzes. Okay, so during the week, my students work on podcasts, notes, and study guides for the concept or concepts on the pacing guide. I then mix in hands-on and virtual labs to enhance these concepts as needed. Then on the day before our weekly quizzes, which is normally Thursday, I review the week's material with my students using a program you may be familiar with called Discourse. Some of you may have even used this program before and are surprised it's still around, right? I believe it to be the best method of exposing my students to both summative and formative questions they may encounter on my assessments and the MME and ACT as well. In this slide, you see an example of a typical formative question I use with my students. This one happens to be on the evolution of the atmosphere. Discourse allows me to connect with my students' computers, their laptops in class, and send them these questions and actually see what they're doing answer-wise. If you want to know more about Discourse, I have the discs. Ask me questions about it later in this session. And here you see an example of a summative question on the formation of the atmosphere. Before we actually start the review, I have my students get their notes out and open up their study guides to use. While I encourage them to try and answer the questions without using their notes or study guides, I want them to go find the answers if necessary. Okay, now just a quick review of what I do in my classroom. Students click on the podcast link in Moodle to access it. They then take notes while watching the podcast, and I tell them what to write in the podcast. Then they take a picture of their notes and submit them to Moodle. Once they've done that, they go to Moodle and open up the podcast study guide and answer the question using their notes and the podcast itself if necessary. And they write on the study guide in bold or a different color. Then they submit that study guide to Moodle. Then lastly, I use Discourse to review the week's concept with them before our weekly quiz, which is on Fridays. If this all seems like a lot of work, you're right. It is, up front. However, if you're like me, you're constantly reevaluating your teaching methods to find the best way to reach your students, right? I want my classroom to take advantage of what my students know and like as much as possible. Technology in my classroom makes sense because it makes sense to my students. It's part of who they are. I also want my students to be ready for the technology used in college right now. Yes, the switchover takes time and effort, but it's effort I was putting into the lesson planning for my classes anyway. Lastly, if I do this right, I can use these same podcasts year after year and just make tweaks and adjustments when necessary. I can then use my planning time to find the best resources to enhance my students' learning. In effect, I become the best learning guide as possible. Okay, thanks for listening.